G'day and welcome to another live recording of the ManKind podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove that there's more than just one way to be a man. Now, throughout the past couple episodes, we have been talking with various experts and people of experience in many different facets of, that relate to manhood, masculinity, boyhood psychology. And it's been great to gain insights from these experts as to how we as men, boys, or all people can become champions for certain persons, certain people that have been impacted by various things in life. And a big part of the mission for the ManKind podcast is to really lean into the discomfort of courageous conversations, which means dealing with, very difficult and uncomfortable topics. And today we are going to stand in the fire with Emiliano Diaz de Leon. He's a men's engagement specialist from Texas, and he is going to share his experience and his wisdom from his, decades now of experience working with men and boys who have been impacted by sexual violence. So it has to be said at the beginning, trigger warning on this episode. Really important that whether yourself personally, someone close to you that you love, or even someone that you may not know who might have been affected by sexual violence, consider who's in the room listening with you and just take care of yourself. Really take the time to check in and see if right now is the time to actually listen to this, because now may not be the time, but there may be a time later on. So Emiliano, I'll give you a chance, mate, to introduce yourself and we'll get underway.
Thank you, Brandon. So happy to be with you today. And I think it is appropriate because April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And I can't think of a more appropriate time to have this conversation, especially with the boys and men in your audience, right? My name is Emiliano Diaz de Leon. I am the men's engagement specialist with the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. We are the Sexual Assault Coalition here in Texas. We represent all of the rape crisis centers in Texas. And I've been with TAASA now for 13 years, working primarily in the areas of prevention and victim advocacy. So I work with folks who are doing prevention education and providing services to victims and survivors of sexual violence throughout Texas. And then, of course, I do consulting work on these issues around the country, and I've done some work internationally. And so I'm just thrilled to be with you today, and I appreciate the trigger warning. I think it's so important for folks to just keep that in mind as you're listening to this conversation. And if you need to take a break, if you need to walk away, if you need to, do some self-care, whatever that is for you, I want to encourage you to do that. If you need to seek support, I'll be sharing some resources where you can do that. But we want to encourage you to take care of yourself during this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, mate. Beautiful check-in there. And I think to kind of set this up and put it into context, we've seen a really great impact of movements like #MeToo to shed light on the experience of women and girls of sexual harassment, sexual assault. And I think that with the rising of the tides in that space, I think it's very common to not even consider that there are actually men and boys who themselves are impacted by sexual violence. We were talking some of the stats before we went live. Not a lot of people know that 1 in 6 men have had an experience of sexual violence or harassment in their lives. So, mate, how common, outside of that number, how common, well, not how common is it? Why do you think that is? Why do you think that is that we don't commonly think about men and boys as the victims of such a thing?
Yeah, I think for folks just to keep that in mind and think about the boys and men in your life that you know, that you love, that you live with, that you work with, that you worship with. And 1 in 6 of those men would have had some experience of sexual violence. I think that's just a profound reality. We also know that that's the most current research that we have. So unfortunately, it may be higher than that because because of the how difficult it is to disclose or to
Yeah.
report the abuse, right? So
Yeah.
we acknowledge that it could be potentially higher, and it's important to keep that in mind, because I think you are going to encounter men from different backgrounds, different races, different ages, sexual orientations, religions, socioeconomic backgrounds, etc., um, who have had some experience of sexual violence or sexual abuse, whether it was during their childhood or as adults. And I think it's important just to acknowledge that reality, and encourage people to keep that in mind as they talk to the boys and men in their lives, right? That of that reality, that it's so important for them to be prepared to have these conversations earlier rather than later on in life. I think I'm a father. I have an 11-year-old boy, and one of the things that we collectively decided as parents is that as soon as he could begin to understand and communicate, that we would begin to have conversations in an age appropriate way, that we would begin to read books that talked about boundaries, that talked about what was appropriate and what was not appropriate in terms of touches. And so, and that's been an ongoing conversation as parents. And so that's why it's so critical for us to engage in this conversation, not just during the month of April, but all the time, right? We want to center the experiences of survivors and really listen to their stories, and acknowledge that this is a crisis in our country, that we have all of us have an opportunity to address. And ultimately, our mission here at TAASA is to end sexual violence, right? Whether it happens in my lifetime, I believe that it will happen, that we will be able to end sexual violence, not just in this country, but around the world. But it requires sort of a collective action, an awareness, a conversation. It requires funding. It requires, our time and our money and all of the things that make providing those services to victims and survivors possible, so that they can heal, and ultimately
Yeah.
we can work towards preventing sexual violence and sexual abuse.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think we'd be doing a disservice to the whole topic at hand if we didn't speak to, like, where does this come from? Like,
Mm.
rather than speak to the symptom and find the perpetrators, lock them up and throw away the key, dust your hands off, job done. No, let's actually talk about what sets this up. So, from your experience, what have you noticed have been uh, the variables or the key components that have come into the perpetrator? Like, what creates someone who's willing to perpetrate sexual violence?
Well, I think it's important for your audience to understand that sexual violence is an act of power. It's an act of control, and it's not an act of it's not a sexual act. It's an act of violence, and I think that's why our language is so critical to talk about it as a form of violence. So when I think about this issue, I tend to use sexual violence rather than sexual assault or sexual abuse, even though those are part of our terminology in terms of when we talk about this issue. So it absolutely is an act of power, right? There's nothing um, there's nothing psychological about offenders or perpetrators. Um, they can be anyone, and I think that's important for us to understand, that the way that that society is structured in terms of power and oppression, in terms of patriarchy and the ideas around manhood that we have in terms of power in controlling somebody and um, having access, uh, those all contribute to sexual violence, right? These things, these there's all these societal contributions that make sexual violence possible, and I think it's important for us to understand that anyone could abuse, and it ultimately is a choice of being able to control or to intimidate or threaten. It's also generational, unfortunately. It's important for us to understand that those folks who have been abused themselves are not necessarily going to go on to abuse themselves.
Although it's very common that those who perpetrate were once victims, or sorry, once are victims themselves, generally.
Yeah. When we look at the research and the interview perpetrators and offenders, they do have their own histories of violence and abuse, including sexual violence and abuse. But I think that's not always the case, right? It's difficult to identify an offender or perpetrator in our midst, right? We know, like we can look right now. I can look online and see what registered sex offenders are living in my neighborhood. Any of us can do that. But they're registered sex offenders. They've been accused and convicted of a crime of sexual violence, right? But the offenders are known to us, our neighbors, and unfortunately our family members and our friends and the people that we live with, the people that we love, that we admire, that we respect. And I think that's why it's the issue of sexual violence is so pervasive, because it happens so close to home, right? I think people, when they think about sexual violence, they think about the rapist, the stranger. But the reality is that the person who is offending, who is abusing, tends to be somebody that we know and that we love and that we live with, right? And I think that's why it's so difficult for us to acknowledge that it's happening to us, and even to report the abuse, because of our fear of losing that person in our life, right? And imagine, for folks who are watching, that's generally the case, that the offender was somebody that they knew. That doesn't mean that it can't happen, that strangers can't abuse, but it's situational. It's those acts of violence. Those are violence, and so they do happen. But I think the majority of sexual violence and sexual abuse is perpetrated by people that we know.
Yeah, it's close to home. So there's a big part of my role is to try and ask difficult questions that may not be popular, right? Just to try and give it a well-rounded view of the whole thing. And so I am going to ask you, soon about redemption for perpetrators. But before we get to that, I want to share an anecdote, kind of a personal experience that I witnessed. And I won't disclose the man's identity, of course, but a man that came into the ManKind project and was in our men's group. He had been, having a lot of trouble in his relationship, a lot of trouble as a parent, as a father, going through a really ugly divorce. And through some of the facilitation and the work in the ManKind project, we were able to identify that the dude was just hooked on power, just throwing his weight around. He did everything he could in the workplace, at home, with his parenting, to just throw his weight around, throw his power around to get what he wanted. What we would archetypally call either a tyrant king or a warrior savage, right? But through some bucketing and through some digging, we were actually able to get to the bottom of that. When he was 13 years old, he went out for a surf. And on his walk home, he went by the public bathrooms, and a man grabbed him and pulled him into the bathrooms and violated him. And when he went home, he wouldn't tell his parents, because his parents were very openly homophobic. And so he went through his teens asking himself, well, am I gay then? Does this mean I'm gay if this happened to me? And when he got into later life and in positions of power, whether in his relationship or in his workplace, it's like, well, someone took my power away, I'm going to take everyone else's away. So I was F-worded, and I'm going to F-word everyone else in my life because something was taken from me. And what that although he never committed, to his words, never committed sexual violence to anyone else, he was doing it in other ways.
Yeah.
He was finding other ways to throw his power around. So what are some other impacts? What are some other knock-on effects have you seen from some of the victims that you've
Yeah.
worked with?
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think folks who are watching will probably, they have their own stories in terms of from the boys and men in their lives that have experienced a similar type of abuse, whether it was one time or ongoing. Unfortunately, offenders, uh, the abuse can be ongoing by the same individual or multiple individuals in a family. Or and again, I think that's the most difficult thing to accept, right? But I think his response is common, is all too common amongst boys and men. And I think that's why it's really important for us to pay attention to the responses, especially changes in behavior, changes in mood, whether it's substance abuse, engaging in risky behavior, suicidal, being suicidal, engaging in healthy, unhealthy sexual behavior. So there's all these indicators that will pop up at different times for boys and men, right? And I think it's important for us as family members and friends to pay attention to that, right? To notice and to intervene when we can and however we can, because like you said, if there's not early intervention, if there's not if we're not able to surround that individual with care in terms of the support that they need, or the unconditional love or acceptance, or even the belief, it's so important that we just believe survivors. So when a boy and man tells us that this happened to them, we're like, well, what were you doing, right? We have this strong reaction because we believe, because of these ideas about masculinity, is that we have to protect ourselves. We can't let anybody hurt us. We have to be tough, and we can't let anybody take advantage of us, especially sexually and or physically. And so when it happens to us, there's a tremendous amount of shame and guilt wrapped up in that. And then when we're not believed or accused that we were responsible for the abuse, that's detrimental, right, to the victim and to the survivor in terms of their ability to heal. And wherever you are in that process, right, because it is a process, that it really is a journey. And I think it's important for folks that are watching to understand that the ManKind Project can be a part of the journey of healing for a lot of men, because there are not a lot of places where they can go to do that healing work, where they can begin to undo the damage that from these experiences, right, that are very much linked to masculinity, right? So our response to our experiences of abuse are very much linked to our ideas about manhood, and that's why it's so painful to hear that another boy or man that we know or love has experienced this, especially at the hands of another man, right? Which is usually the case. So yeah.
This makes me think back, of course. Have you heard of the term man box?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Tony Porter talks a lot about the man box, right? The unspoken rules of the playground.
Yeah.
Right. Don't be weak. Don't show your emotions. You need to, establish power, establish strength. And I can see the links there, right?
Yeah.
That if someone violates me and abuses me, then I essentially have lost power. I need to regain it somehow. And what has blown my mind in this work has been the amount of healing I've seen men go through around sexual shame around this work. I mean, of course, there's breakthroughs left and right for things that don't relate to sex at all, but the shame that men hold around sex, I think, must contribute to this as well. whether it's pornography from an early age, thinking your penis isn't big enough, or like, I see how this all ties in
Absolutely.
right to this, that
Yeah.
men aren't the ones to be abused, right? And so I want to ask you though, I th- to me, I think it's very important to validate the experience of people, regardless of the objective truth. That if their reality is telling them one thing, right, you should treat it that way. Um, have you ever seen Have you ever seen cases of people kind of crying wolf, that actually haven't been telling the truth, or in your experience, has it just been like unanimously people are coming in with just real cases and examples?
That's an important question. I imagine your audience is wondering the same thing. Um, the majority of cases that I've experienced as a victim advocate, and I was a victim advocate for more than 2 decades before I came to TAASA, every survivor that I encountered was a survivor of violence and abuse, right? Whether it was reported or not. I think what's so difficult for boys and men is that they don't come forward, they don't report the abuse. There's no,
It's taboo.
yeah, partly it's because they don't, there's no evidence, right? And I think because of our criminal justice system, in terms of the way that the laws are written around sexual violence, you have to be able to prove that there was an act of sexual violence, that there was some form of penetration, and that's difficult to prove, right? If you do not immediately conduct a rape kit. So boys and men are reluctant to do that. It's much more common for children, especially if they disclose the abuse early or immediately. So I think it's important for folks to understand that when children disclose abuse, then we are all obligated to report that abuse to law enforcement and to the authorities, right? And then immediately a process begins where that evidence is collected and preserved to eventually, to charge and convict the offender. Now, when boys and men come, like when men come forward, it's usually much later in life, right? Because of that, the shame, the guilt, the fear. It might be they might not come forward until the offender has passed away, because it's a prominent family member or friend of the family. It might be somebody who is a prominent coach, a prominent pastor, community leader, etc. Right? So there's a tremendous amount of shame and fear of again reporting an individual, and it's even more true for individuals that are immigrants or refugees and their offenders are citizens, right? In terms of the fear of being detained, and so there's a lot that happens, especially for men who are in detention or in jail or in prison, who experience sexual violence at the hands of the people who are of the guards or other inmates, right? So there are these vast experiences of sexual violence among boys and men, that again, because our system is designed appropriately to respond to the majority of victims of sexual violence, which are girls and women, we haven't really figured out how to design systems of support and services for boys and men. And that's a big part of the work that I do here in Texas, and with other sexual assault coalitions and rape crisis centers around the country, is to help them think about, okay, so what are the critical, what's the infrastructure that we have to build in order to also provide services to the boys and men in their communities, right? And so because it's just not common enough, right? If you look at if you go and look at your local reports of sexual violence and look at the gender breakdown, you're going to see that the smaller percentages of boys and men just that are reporting at your local municipal level. And so that's why it's so important for us to encourage boys and men to come forward when they are ready to report the abuse, right? Or to collect, to do the collection, so that we can eventually hold the offender or perpetrator accountable. So yeah, it's difficult to even fathom or to even to believe,
Yeah.
that this is happening.
I think it's also the fact that we're having this conversation is a step forward in normalizing the conversation. I love that
Absolutely.
you're speaking with your little boy about it. Just early, a very Fred Rogers approach. I like that. Very nice. I think there's a lot of hysteria right now. There's a lot of energy that's being kicked around, thrown around men's involvement in all of this. You've got some people feeling like it's just a complete painting of men, right? Broad stroking all men, that men
Mhm.
abuse their power, throw their weight around, are the oppressors. And, what do you think are the best steps as far as helping invite versus indict men into this conversation? Like, what do you think is the best way to invite men into this conversation so that rather than say, well, I, Brandon Clift, am going to be a man who doesn't commit sexual violence, to go, no, I'm going to be a champion for those who are victims. And I'm going to be a champion to speak up against those who I believe are condemning
Absolutely.
or throwing their power. How do you think we should invite men into that conversation?
Well, I will tell you how I ended up here. And I started, I'm a survivor myself of family violence. So I grew up experiencing, witnessing um, all types of violence growing up, both on the street and at home, right, at school. And so that ultimately brought me to my local rape crisis center here in Austin, Texas. And when I came to the center, I came as a volunteer. I wanted to get involved. I wanted to do something. I wanted to be that change, right? And I just approached them and said, I'd really like to volunteer. I'd like to get involved in this issue. And so, um, just like here in most rape crisis centers around the country, volunteers are required to go through a pretty intensive training. And it was through that training that I learned how to be a victim advocate, right? How to be an ally for victims and survivors, all victims and survivors, right? And from that moment, my work transitioned from being a volunteer to eventually working as a victim advocate at the battered women's shelter here in Austin, because it was sort of like I felt like I needed to contribute, I needed to do more. And at the time, I was the first and only man working in a battered women's shelter here in Austin, in terms of their history of having a male identified person working as a victim advocate. Now, 2 decades later, that's not. There are countless number of men who are volunteers and who are working for Safe Alliance here in Austin, right? So one man can change the trajectory of the way that we think about men's role in this work, right? It just takes one man that is willing to do the work and to learn from the girls and women who have been engaged in this work much longer than me or much longer than us as a collective group, but who invited me into that space, who trained me, who mentored me. So everything that I know, everything I'm talking about is a result of of what I learned from girls and women. So I think in the process, I'm mentoring and working with other men who are now engaged in the work, right? So there's this sort of growing group of men, these champions for change, right, that you were talking about, that are engaged both in the prevention side and the victim advocacy side. The more that we invite men into this space to work with victims and survivors, um, one of the things that we realize is the impact that has, not just on victims and survivors, that there are good, healthy, nonviolent, loving, nurturing, etc. men, right, in their community, who are allies. And I think that's why just getting involved, whether it's donating or volunteering or just showing up, just believing survivors in your life, and making sure that when we talk about sexual violence, that our language is inclusive of all kinds of people, Um, and that's why it's so important for us to talk about like men and male identified folks and transgender men and boys who experience sexual violence as well. Like we need to open up that, like, our broaden our discussions around sexual violence so that men feel like they have a space in this dialogue, right, in this discussion. And I think that's why this conversation is so critical.
Yeah. So it's almost like we're speaking about the act, the problem, the impacts, the solution, and hopefully trying to remove the association that sexual violence equals a man did it. We're actually just speaking to the act itself and getting people on the path to healing.
Yeah, I'm more concerned, honestly, I think I'm more concerned about the victim and survivor than the offender or perpetrator. I think while our work is critical and important, the needs of male survivors is just as important, right? It's not. I think it's important for your audience to understand to me, there's no distinction in terms of the needs of boys and men who experience sexual violence from the needs of girls and women, right? Now, the way that we provide services, the way that we think about talking about this issue has to be different.
The approach is going to be different.
The approach is going to be different.
Sure.
And the services will look different. But everyone who is watching needs to understand that boys and men have the same access to services that girls and women do, right? In every community, there's a rape crisis center. And so it's critically important that you get involved, that you support, that you learn as much as you can about their work, so that when you do encounter a survivor in your life, male or female, regardless of their gender or their identity, that you're able to refer them, you're able to go with them, accompany them, or to refer them to the local rape crisis center. Because that's an important place for boys and men to heal. And to get the assistance that they need to start the process of reporting the abuse or just doing the healing work, the therapy of addressing their experiences of violence.
Yeah, good to hear. Mate, there's so many facets to this. I came in with 6 questions. Now I've got 60.
That's good.
I want to talk to you about the offender, the perpetrator. I didn't, I've this, and no way are we trying to absolve anyone from their acts or their crimes, or I can't speak for us. So let me say me. But I always grew up learning about Charles Manson, going, well, that dude was a psychopath, right? He committed some horrible acts. And when I found out about his childhood, I went, no wonder he committed what he went through horrible things, and in turn did 10 times worse. But if there is a way to measure, what's your stance? What are your thoughts around redemption for the offender, the perpetrator? Like, is it just not an option? Lock them up, throw away the key. You've played your cards wrong in this life, or have you seen men, women, any perpetrator actually redeemed to turn things around?
It's a great question. And this is hard, right? Because I think like I said earlier, while our focus is on the victim and survivor, the first step for offenders, right? If we want to call them offenders, perpetrators, however we want to label those individuals that commit these acts, the first step is accountability, right? Them holding themselves accountable, and the community holding them accountable, right? That there's some form of restorative justice that happens, right? That don't necessarily that are not connected to the criminal justice system, especially because we know that system, unfortunately, the way that the laws are designed, tend to allow offenders and perpetrators to walk away without conviction, and so they may get charged, they may get arrested, and spend some time in jail, but they eventually come back out into our communities, and unfortunately they tend to reoffend, and so what is needed is really intensive mental health care to undo their own trauma, right? To
Yes.
undo their own trauma, and to be able um, to provide them with the skills, right? To be able to manage their relationships, their behavior healthy and non-violently, right? Um, but that's not the case, right? Like that's like for most of us who are watching, there are no systems of accountability that for offenders, and most of them get away with it and they continue to abuse, and unfortunately, by the time that uh, they are caught, it's maybe after 2 or 3 times. So there can be redemption, especially for young people who are engaging in this behavior. The research has shown that it's much more effective if there's early intervention for young people who have engaged in some sexually abusive behavior. There tends to be more transformation and more change of behavior. So we're finding that to be really effective. Um, but for adult men, that isn't always the case, in terms of if there are no systems of accountability in that community, in that place of worship, in that workplace, then that individual just then goes on to reoffend. Um, Now, do I believe that offenders can change? Yes. Do most offenders want to change? From my experience of working with offenders and perpetrators, it's they're just not they're not invested in the same way that I would like them to be. And it is possible. There are individuals who have offended, who have gone on to be successful, right? I mean, I think the reality that we talked about earlier is that there are plenty of offenders around us that are never, again, they're never reported, and they're
Yeah.
never held accountable, and they go
Sure.
on to they go on to abuse.
Yeah.
And so it's really difficult to say,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Well done in doing your best to answer that one too, because I ask it merely as it is a difficult question. I mean, is it a question, or is it just like more like just stating something that's a challenge or a problem? And I know time is short, and I'm really grateful for you bringing the big guns of your experience to the table. So forgive me if this question is out of scope, because I know you've mentioned a couple times that you primarily work with victims, right, on the healing path. But have you seen cases or worked with cases of men, boys that have been actually wrongly accused and that have been caught up in the system of condemnation? And have you seen examples of that? And do you have any thoughts around how we can support people like that who have been wrongly accused? Because I speak to people all the time who have people in their lives who have been accused of such things, and whether it's true or not, I don't know. But
Yeah,
it comes as such a shock to them that person would be branded with this.
yeah.
So curious of your thoughts.
That's a great question. I think the the most important thing that we can do as friends or family members of that individual is to trust our gut, like our gut feeling, our instincts about that individual, right? And whether what they're saying or what the victim is saying is true, right? Because, like I said earlier, it's so difficult to prove sexual violence, because most of the time that act of violence happens behind closed doors. The offender ensures is grooming the individual. It's also ensuring that there's no witnesses. They're enforcing a code of silence with the victim, and so we don't. Again, it's extremely difficult to prove in a court of law because of the requirements around evidence. And so we are then put in a position where we have to either we have to believe the survivor and believe the offender, and especially when they're saying that they didn't engage in that abusive behavior. So we have to make, like, ultimately it is decision of family members and friends to make that determination, because again, it's so difficult to prove, especially um, if there's no evidence collected, or it's gone through the criminal justice system to prove in a court of law that the offender engaged in that abusive behavior. So that's why I always begin by believing, right? I'm going to begin by believing the survivor. And I'm going to have to ultimately going to have to choose whether I believe the offender or the perpetrator. But the research shows that most reports of violence and abuse are valid from the victim, right? There's very little to none false reporting in this area, and so I think that's the really, it's difficult for us to believe that individual who we know, that we love and that we respect, would engage in that kind of behavior. It's extremely difficult. That is like I've experienced that myself in terms of mentors, family members, colleagues, friends. I've had my share of experiences of people in my life who have engaged in behavior, and then they said, "Oh no, I didn't do it." But it's really, again, I have to decide for myself whether I want to believe them, and because there's no proof, I have to just really trust my instinct, and my instinct. I will tell folks, like, The Gift of Fear by Gavin DeBecker is so important when we talk about sexual violence, and understanding and protecting ourselves from offenders, right? He wrote a fantastic book called Protecting the Gift that I recommend to all the parents who are watching, because it really helps us understand that ultimately that person that we have a feeling about, we need to trust that feeling, for all the reasons that I said, because this is so difficult to prove one way or another. And of course, we need to do more work to strengthen laws that protect victims and survivors and hold offenders accountable, right? There's still a lot of work, even here in Texas, that we're engaged in right now in the legislative session. But just nationally, it's really a mixed bag of laws and around offender programs, or holding offenders accountable, or registering sex offenders. So, it's really difficult to say, but I would leave it to the individual to decide, right, for themselves.
It really is. I think there's a big part of, my granddad, one of the sweetest, most beautiful men on the planet. We had a very close relationship before he passed away.
Yeah.
And I remember growing up, like, he would kind of hug. This is in the South as well.
Yeah.
He would give my grandma, or like my mum, who's not his daughter, a pat on the bum when he would hug them. And it was kind of like I think it was very societally. It was just a thing that was done at the time.
Yeah.
Right. I don't think there were people back then would have seen that as something that was wrong. But I think some of those little, what's the word I'm thinking of? Just those little traits, those little things that I think we naturally can inherit and pick up from our parents. I think that has a lot of, and I think we need to get clear on the conversation of, like, black and white, like what is right, what is wrong. I love that you're talking to your son about touch, teaching about what's appropriate, what isn't. I think there's a lot of fear right now for men that these things that they may have been doing for a long time, that in their deepest hearts, like really, like on a soul level, they would have never thought to have a negative impact on someone. That these habits, behaviors, all of a sudden it's like, oh, hey, they're nice now. There's been this big shift in consciousness around the world around what's right, what's wrong. And I think it sounds like there's a gap between what's societally accepted as right and wrong and habitual behaviors, right? Even on the smallest level. So I think there's a lot of men right now that are really terrified that the pitchforks are going to come for them. So I judge this to be like a a messy, there's no real linear, straightforward approach to this, right? Other than just continuing to have the conversation. But I did see a physical change in you just now. I want to get your thoughts on that.
No, that's real. I want to invite men into this conversation, right? We have to have conversations about consent. Nobody, especially as adult men, nobody, because of the Act Like a Man box that you were referring to earlier from Paul Kivel and Tony Porter. I think when you think about how we enforce that, right? These ideas about masculinity, one of the things that we're not taught is about just like, what does healthy sexual behavior look like?
Yes.
Right? That's why it's so critical for me to, because nobody had those conversations with me when I was a boy. There was never, my mother was not comfortable having those conversations with me, being a child of being raised by a single parent.
Yeah.
So she never had those conversations with me. The men in my life never had the conversations with me. And so I ended up learning on my own, right? From my peers and from, magazines, from porn. I got all these ideas about what was appropriate, and they weren't healthy. They weren't healthy ideas of sex and sexuality. And so I engaged. I think one of the things that's really important for folks to understand is that we have to be reflective and think about, okay, these ideas, I got them from all of these places, from music, from movies, from television, about engaging in sex, right? In the role that we as men have in the act of sex, right? In the expectation of sex. And we're not talking to each other about that. And when we're talking, we're boasting, and we're like, I hit that. And,
I got to second base. Like, dude, you didn't get to home base. Like, right. Come on, man.
Well, we're engaging in these conversations where it's again, about winning, about conquering, around hitting that, like all of those things that, I'm guilty of.
Guilty, right here too.
Guilty of engaging in that kind of language and that kind of behavior.
Yeah.
Until I began to just be reflective and to learn, right, from the women that I was dating, about what was appropriate, right? I was learning from them in terms of what was acceptable.
Yes.
What did consent look like for them? What kind of behavior were they comfortable in engaging in? And so it's an ongoing conversation, regardless of whether we're dating somebody and we're engaging in a sexual act with them. There needs to be consent. We just need to be able to have that conversation. As men. We need to ask for consent, and we need to receive consent as well. So consent is not just a one-way street. It's not something where, men, you guys need to go ask for consent. No. It's about making sure that you're engaging in a conversation about what is appropriate and what we're comfortable with, and how far are we going to take this sexual behavior. Yeah. And that's why, again, as parents, especially of boys, it's important to have those conversations about body autonomy, what is appropriate and what is not okay. I'll give you an example. My son just started school in person. He's been going to school, 6th grade, virtually from home for the last year. So this week he just went back to school, and there was a classmate that was getting into his physical space, that was touching his laptop, that was trying to get into his backpack, right? And because of COVID, they have to be separate, right? But this classmate was getting in his space, and it made him very uncomfortable. And he had to articulate multiple times to his classmate that he was uncomfortable with them getting into his space because of COVID, primarily because of COVID, and because it wasn't okay. The student was touching their stuff without their permission. And that's just a real world example of how important it is for us to teach our children, to teach young men and men the language of both giving and receiving consent, right? Like of having honest conversations with each other about what is healthy sex look like, right? What kind of behavior do I want to engage in? And it's about communication, right? And unfortunately, because of the Act Like a Man box, one of the things that we're not giving it are those tools. They're not readily available to us as boys. We're not conditioned or trained to communicate, to use words.
Nor is it readily modeled.
Exactly. And so that's why it's so important for my son for us to engage in these conversations and to have honest conversations and open conversations. And as he's experiencing puberty, like, this has been one of the most difficult conversations for me as a parent and as a man, because nobody had that conversation with me. Like, I was figuring things out on my own, and we had, he loves books, and so we gave him a book about puberty, and we said, like, if you want to come and talk to us about it, you have questions from the book. He read the whole book in one sitting, but wasn't comfortable. Like, he didn't have questions. We're like, okay, well, if you have questions, whenever you have questions about anything you just read, or you want information, you want more information, let us know. Nobody did that with me.
Sure.
Nobody had that conversation with me.
Yeah.
So that's how transformative our relationships and are, the power that we have as men to model, like, healthy sexuality, right? There's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with engaging in behavior that is consensual, right? Like, we have to seek consent for ourselves, like, and I think that's really important, that it is for us as men to understand that it is a two-way street, and we don't have the language yet. We're still figuring it out. We're going to make mistakes. But
work in progress.
We're work in progress when it comes to this issue. And we have a lot to learn. And there are a lot of examples of what not to say or do. And we have to pay attention to that. But the reality is, there's a lot of boys and men who are engaged in healthy relationships and healthy sexual behavior. And those are the guys that I want to watch and to learn from. And because I want to have enjoyable, pleasurable, healthy sex. You know what I mean? Like, there's nothing, I think it's important.
I think we can all
I think we all agree with that. So, and I want that for all the girls and women in my life now, and I think that's so important, just to be able to engage in those conversations throughout our life, right? And so that we don't feel like the onus is on us.
Yeah. And thank you for saying that. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. First of all, rookie error. Apologies, Emiliano. Apologies, audience. Got to grab my charger. I'll be 2 seconds.
Take your time. And thank you, everybody who's tuning in. I can't see you, or I can't see what you're sharing in the comments, but I appreciate you tuning in.
So, all right, that was embarrassing. So,
oh no, don't apologize.
So, mate, yes, thank you for saying that. I think you just touched on something that is a very, a conversation that when people talk about the power of men, right? That I don't think often enough that we speak it to the fact that men are expected to be the first to bring up a lot of things around dating, sex, many other things. Like, it's societally expected that men pick up the tab and pick up the bill, that men go for the first kiss, right? That are the first to ask for consent. And I think if we can take some of that, societally take some of that pressure off of men, that there are these big high stake moments when you're courting someone, dating someone, to be like, well, no, let's open it up to both parties, right? To communicate what that consent looks like. So it's not this big, oh, did he make it to second base? Well, no, did she? Right? Did they get there together? Not just it all being on the man. So thank you for speaking to that.
No, I appreciate you saying that. I think my experience with my partner, right, who I've been married to for now, 19 years, I think. If I'm wrong, I'm in so much trouble. But we've been married for a long time, and before that, we were dating for a long time, right? And so nobody talked to me about this, right? Like nobody, but I wanted to be in a healthy relationship. And this was like the first healthy relationship that I had ever been in as a young man when I met my partner. And she was aware of my experiences of violence and abuse. She was aware of, even if folks look into my own personal story, I engaged in abusive behavior as a teenager in my early teen relationships. All of that sort of informs my ideas and how critical it is for me to engage in, for when I entered this relationship, to have conversations early with my partner about the expectations, about what was expected, because those cultural, not just the societal expectations, but there were cultural expectations on top of that, right? And that's true for people regardless of their identity or their sexual orientation, or there are these forces. And one of the things that was an important lesson for me is just to be willing to be vulnerable, right? And to engage in hard conversations, and to be held accountable, to allow myself to be held accountable when I made mistakes, and to communicate ongoing to this day, that we're constantly communicating with each other what our needs and our desires are, right?
Absolutely.
So that's true for folks who are in partnerships, folks who are dating, folks who just want to engage in sex. Like, consent is critical. Like, just engaging in a conversation about what you want and what you want to do and what's pleasurable and what you need from your partner. I can't tell you, I really wish that there was a man in my life that had, or woman in my life that had come to have that conversation with me at an early age. I wouldn't have made as many mistakes as I did, and I wouldn't, I would have had better information about my sexual health, right? And I think it's, again, because of those forces, and because it's so, like, it's taboo. Oh, this is making me really uncomfortable, right? My son is really uncomfortable. Like, even right now, he's really uncomfortable with the idea of talking about puberty. It makes him really uncomfortable. Well, that's natural. That's natural for boys, and for girls as well at that age, to talk openly and honestly, because, again, it's not part of our culture. It's not something we're learning at school. It's not something, we easily have access to. We don't have information. And so for us, it was critical to have those conversations, and hopefully he will continue to come to me with questions and with, his experiences. And
I love that. What you did is you opened the door to him. You made it possible, whether he does or he doesn't, he knows it's an option. Here's a challenge for all those listening out there. I initially was going to say, here's a challenge for all the blokes out there, but no, here's a challenge for everyone. And I did this for the first time when I first started dating my partner, Christine, and I've never done it before. But, we'd been on a couple dates, and I asked her, I said, "Can I kiss you?" And it took her by surprise. Like, she'd never heard that question before. I had never said that question before, asked that question before. But she told me after the fact, she said, if you would have leant in and kissed me, I would have rejected it. But the fact that you asked me, it gave her a chance to go, well, yeah, I would like that. Not to say that I'm the model of the model of the change that's needed. All I'm saying is it worked for me, and it was a great confidence booster, I think, in our early stages of dating, that we established right from the get-go, like, hey, guess what? You know what? You can pick up the tab next time, love.
and you know what? That is changing, right? When we watch romantic comedies, when we watch films, and when we watch shows, we're seeing the shift in our culture, right? Around some of these expectations on the part of men and the part of women, and the, like, folks, we're seeing different ideas of relationships, right? And I think those models, those examples are so important to have and to be able to talk about. Those are all learning moments for us as adult men, even with our boys in our lives, to be able to talk about the things that they're consuming within the culture, right? That whether it's ideas that are reinforcing these problematic behaviors, or they're ideas of these these things that are outside of the norm, right? That we're trying to get to a different place of being, right? Like my son is a very different boy just right now as an 11-year-old boy than I was. So I can only imagine the kind of boy, like the kind of man he's going to be.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So just imagine in one generation, ended violence, ended abuse, and have transformed the like masculinity in such a significant way that 11-year-old boy is like so far like of where I am now as an adult man, right? So I think that's important for us to understand that that's the power of our relationships and our ability to model what this sort of new masculinity can look like, right? Like I want to embody that. I want to like I'm a sponge, right? Like I want to absorb and I want to learn and I want to read things and I want to engage in conversations with him so that because he has access to information that I didn't when I was his age. And so
you're helping him look beyond the boundaries that are the live like a man box.
Yeah.
Right. The act like a man box. There are no boundaries or borders here to him. Right. You're making it endless, the possibilities.
We're breaking the box, right? We talked here at TAASA, we did a campaign called Break the Box. And,
Break the box.
And so that's what we're doing. Like we're just literally engaging in breaking that box, those traditional ideas that we have about masculinity, and creating something new, something beautiful, something wonderful, something healthy, something something different. And I think that's what to me is what is so exciting about this conversation. It's just like you said earlier, like opening a door for my son. This is opening a door and giving men and women permission to have a conversation. The folks who are listening, I want you to talk to I want you to share this podcast with them, and I want you to just have a conversation over your kitchen table, like while you're walking with your partner, while you're hanging out with your kid. Like that is how we change the culture, right? Like that's how we transform our society so that these expectations that you were talking about just begin to disappear. And we have a whole new way of, and I understand the resistance. Like I understand it completely. There are going to be men and women who are listening to this who are resistant to the idea of change.
But right? we can do our part by, rather than point our fingers at them and call them wrong, extend our hands and hold theirs to support them to look at a potential new way of looking at it.
Absolutely. I think that's why dialogue and conversation is so critical, right? Because these ideas are really entrenched in our society, and they ultimately take a long time for us to unpack, right? And to look at. And it's painful and it's difficult, but it can also be joyful. It can be exciting. Again, the unpacking is important for us to do together, and for us to do with other men, right? So one of the things that we're doing here in Texas is we have a monthly virtual gathering for male identified folks that want to do the work. So folks who are engaged in the work as prevention educators or victim advocates, or who are new to the work, who want to learn more, that want to engage the boys and men in their communities around healthy, about these ideas around healthy masculinity. And so it's called Texas Men Speak. And so we get together every fourth Thursday of the month for 1 hour. So any male identified person here in Texas is invited into that space to engage in these critical conversations with each other, right? And it's important that we have the language and the skills then to be able to go and engage in those conversations with the girls and women in our lives, right? With our family members and our friends and our coworkers and our classmates and our, the people that we worship with, right? That's where change happens, right? If we can begin at the individual level, then eventually we believe that that'll change our society. Absolutely. And we have to start somewhere. And so I'm happy to start this conversation with you, and I hope that folks will continue this conversation, online.
Yeah, you never know the ripple, mate. You never know
Yeah.
the ripple effect that conversations like this can have. And, naively before we hit record and went live, I said, hey, let's try and keep this to 30 to 40 minutes, not giving enough credence and credit to to the how big this topic is.
It
But
is.
I'm so grateful that we've been able to round it out on a really high note, a really positive level.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
mate, one question for you before I ask you to tell us more about how we can get involved in your work. And that is, what is giving you the most excitement and hope around your work?
Well, I will tell you, here at TAASA, we just launched a YouTube playlist of these 10 individual stories of male-identified folks talking about exploring these issues related to masculinity, including childhood sexual abuse. My friend and colleague Michael Gwynn shares his story through spoken word about his own experiences. Uh, where he's disclosing this now as an adult man, right? He's a social worker, and he's finally disclosed his experiences of sexual abuse in an amazing piece that's available now on our YouTube channel. So if folks just search TAASA, TAASA on YouTube, they'll find that playlist. I'm super excited about that. Those stories being it's from a project that we did with this group of men last year. And I'm excited that they're now in the world, that people can watch them and share them, and ultimately continue the conversations that we're having here, right? And use them to engage in critical conversations with the boys and men and women in our lives. And I'm really excited about the potential, the impact that you said, the ripple effect of those individual stories, the story of Michael Gwynn, especially this month for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, the kind of that other men, especially men of color, will see and hear his story, and will disclose, will come forward, will begin the healing process from their experiences of sexual abuse.
Beautiful, mate. Beautiful. Well, mate, how can we find out more about your work outside of going to YouTube and listening to those stories?
Yeah. Well, before I talk about myself, I do want to encourage folks who are listening that need support to reach out like we talked about, to their local rape crisis center. There's also a national sexual assault hotline. It's 1-800-656-4673. You can also Google them, and they have a text chat. So if you're in crisis, if you felt triggered, if you need to talk to somebody about your own experiences of sexual violence, I encourage you to reach out to the national hotline. They will connect you to your local rape crisis center. So that's important, and it's both available in English as well as Spanish. And folks who it's accessible to everyone. So it's an important service. I would encourage male survivors that have had some experience of childhood sexual abuse to reach out to 1-in-6, malesurvivor.org, Men Healing. These are all when we think about supporting and helping as a loved one, as a friend, a family member, coworker, etc. These are the resources that we should share with that boy or man in our life. So I definitely encourage folks to reach out to those services if they need support. And then people can find me here at TAASA. Definitely follow us on social media. We're on every social media platform, so definitely follow us at TAASA. Folks can email me at diazdelleon@taasa.org. And but I would encourage folks who are listening to follow me on Twitter if you're interested in learning more about this issue or issues related to masculinity or violence prevention. To definitely follow me on Twitter. That's sort of the place where I share, my thoughts, upcoming conferences, research, training opportunities, etc. So definitely encourage folks to look for me on Twitter. So those are the two primarily places people can find me.
Well, mate, I'm going to get you to email those through to me, all those resources, and I'll make sure that they're in the show notes, not only in this video, but also in the show notes for the podcast when this goes live there. Well, mate, I'm going to have to write a well thought out email or give a phone call to Jeff Pereira to thank him for the introduction to you, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure and honor for me to share this space with you. Clearly, this is something that you've committed a humongous portion of your life to, and the ripple effect of that, the knock-on effect of that, although it may not be able to be quantified, I can just tell that it's huge. I can tell
It
it's
is.
huge.
Yeah.
So
I will tell folks this is my life's work, and as you can tell, I'm very passionate about this particular issue. But yeah, my gratitude to Jeff, and I think a lot of what your conversation with him and Jeff's work continues to inform my thinking about this issue, and so I really appreciate the invitation to be a part of this conversation with you, Brendan. And it's been a pleasure, and I've learned so much just in the conversation, and I appreciate your questions because I know that folks who are listening or watching have the same questions or come into this conversation with the same questions, and I think it's so important that we look for the answers and that we get the answers from solid sources.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, mate. Couldn't agree more. Well, have to give a huge thank you to those of you that have joined us live today. I see we've had over 2,000 of you, which is great. And we've got, comments left and right. I see men sharing vulnerable posts about their experiences. I see women checking in and sharing their thoughts, and a lot of people that are just jumping in and sharing some beautiful stuff with us. So I appreciate your contribution to all of you that have joined us live today. It does not go unnoticed.
Yeah, thank you to the folks who have been sharing. Yeah, I mean, we appreciate that, I think, and I look forward to engaging you in the comments as well. So I definitely plan on doing that.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Well, guys, that has been another episode and live recording of the ManKind podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove that there's more than just one way to be a man. Thank you to all of you out there. Thank you for your check-in. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your continued support. And we're just a month into this wild journey. We're loving it. We're going to keep it rocking, keep it rolling. And I wish you guys a very blessed week. Lots of love.
Thank you, Brandon. Bye.